At the beginning of 1942, the United States was not yet fighting as a nation seeking victory. It was fighting as a nation trying to survive. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, America was in a state of shock, but not yet in a state of strategic equilibrium. Japan advanced almost continuously, capturing island after island, base after base, destroying the old notion of American invulnerability in the Pacific. The Philippines were falling. Singapore was already lost. Japanese troops were advancing toward New Guinea, threatening supply routes between the U.S. and Australia. For the first time in decades, the American leadership realized a simple and terrifying thing. If this offensive was not stopped, the Pacific Ocean would become a Japanese lake. The war was no longer a matter of prestige. It had become a matter of strategic survival. By mid-1942, the situation remained dangerous. But for the first time, there was a chance to change the course of events. Japan had stretched its forces across a vast territory. Its army and navy were strong, but not infinite. Each new island required a garrison, supplies, and aviation. American analysts began to see cracks in this expansion. A strike was needed, not to destroy Japan, but to stop its advance. Guadalcanal was the answer to this question. On the world map, it looked almost invisible, a tropical island in the Solomon Islands chain, covered with jungles, swamps, and mountains. But for the U.S. military, it was of enormous importance. The Japanese were building an airfield there that could become a base for strikes on the communication lines between America and Australia. If this airfield became operational, the strategic situation in the entire South Pacific would change to the detriment of the U.S. The American command was faced with a difficult choice. The Army was not yet ready for large-scale offensive operations. The Marines had limited combat experience. The fleet had suffered losses and was still recovering from Pearl Harbor. But to wait meant allowing Japan to strengthen itself even more. Every month of delay worked against the U.S. That is why the decision to attack Guadalcanal was so risky. It was not a perfectly prepared plan. It was a step taken at the limit of what was possible. America went on the offensive not because it was completely ready, but because it could not afford to do nothing. It was to be the first major attempt to take the initiative away from Japan. For many American soldiers and Marines, Guadalcanal was their first real experience of war. They weren't going to liberate captured cities or rescue allies. They were going into the jungle, where the enemy was almost invisible, where the climate was as deadly as bullets, and where every step forward could be their last. It was a different kind of war. Slow, exhausting, with no clear front lines. The Japanese command did not expect such a turn of events. They believed that the U.S. would not be able to go on the offensive for a long time. Guadalcanal seemed to be a secondary direction, protected not by numbers but by distance. It was this confidence that became their weak point. America chose the island not because it was easy, but because it was unexpected. In August 1942, American ships set sail for the Solomon Islands. It was not a triumphal march, but a quiet, tense operation, full of doubts and uncertainty. No one knew how Japan would react. No one knew if they would have enough strength to hold the island after the landing. But everyone understood that if this step failed, there might not be another offensive for a long time. Guadalcanal became more than just an operation. It became a test of the United States' ability to wage offensive warfare, accept losses, operate far from home, and not retreat after the first blow. It was here that the war in the Pacific was to change its character. America was not seeking victory. It was seeking to prove that the war would no longer be one-sided. The morning of August 7, 1942, did not resemble the beginning of a great historical event. There were no solemn speeches, no confidence that everything was going according to plan. There was only the silence of the ocean, the heavy air of the tropics, and the feeling that something irreversible was ahead. American landing ships were approaching the shores of Guadalcanal, an island that most soldiers had only learned about a few weeks earlier. The landing took place with almost no resistance. This was the first paradox of the campaign. The Marines expected fierce resistance on the beaches, but Japanese forces on the island were limited and unprepared for immediate coastal defense. For many Americans, this created a dangerous illusion. It seemed that the operation might be easier than expected. This illusion did not last long. The first hours after the landing were devoted to chaotic deployment. Equipment got stuck in the sand, supplies were lost, and units got mixed up. The jungle began almost immediately behind the beach, dense and hostile. There were no clear landmarks here, and visibility was often limited to a few meters. The war that the Americans knew from training and theory was ending. The jungle war was beginning. One of the main objectives of the landing was an unfinished Japanese airfield. Its capture was of strategic importance that could not be overestimated. Control of the air meant control of the sea, supplies, and the island itself. The Marines advanced toward this point with caution, not knowing where the enemy was. The tension grew with every step. When the Americans reached the airfield, they again encountered no serious resistance. The Japanese construction units had retreated deeper into the island. The capture of the airfield was the first tangible success of the campaign. It was named Henderson Field, after a pilot who had died earlier in the war. This patch of land was to become the center of the entire struggle for Guadalcanal. But with success came the realization of problems. American troops found themselves far from their main bases, with unstable supply lines. The fleet that delivered the troops could not remain nearby for long due to the threat of Japanese airstrikes and night attacks. It became clear in the early days that if Japan decided to fight seriously for the island, it would be extremely difficult to hold it. The jungle quickly began to take its toll. Heat, humidity, insects, and disease affected the soldiers no less than enemy fire. Food was limited, water was a problem, and medicine was worth its weight in gold. For many Americans, this was their first experience of such an environment, and their bodies reacted harshly. The Japanese response was not long in coming. Although the first landing took them by surprise, the command quickly realized the threat. Guadalcanal could not be lost without a fight. The loss of the airfield meant the loss of control over the entire southern Pacific. An urgent transfer of reinforcements began. Already on the first night, the Americans sensed that the war on the island would be different. Japanese units operated in the dark, conducted reconnaissance in force, and disappeared into the jungle as suddenly as they had appeared. Fear of the night became a constant companion. The enemy was invisible but palpable. The capture of the beaches and airfield was only the beginning. The Americans had done what they had planned, but now the main question arose. Would they be able to hold on to what they had gained? At that moment, it became clear that Guadalcanal would not be a short operation. It would be a test of endurance. The first major U.S. offensive operation began not with triumph, but with anxious anticipation, and it was this anticipation that set the tone for the entire campaign. After the first few days of relative calm, Guadalcanal began to show its true colors. During the day, the island seemed stifling and almost motionless, but at night it came alive. Darkness, jungle, and constant humidity created conditions in which war lost its usual contours. It was here that the Japanese army felt confident, and it was here that the Americans had to learn to fight from scratch. The first serious Japanese counterattacks were not massive strikes. They resembled probing, attempts to find weak spots in the American defense. Small units crept up at night, checked out posts, attacked suddenly, and disappeared just as quickly. These skirmishes didn't always leave many dead, but they were mentally draining. The soldiers hardly slept, and the tension never let up. The American defense around Henderson Field was gradually taking shape, but it was far from perfect. The trenches were dug in a hurry. The positions often had no clear boundaries, and communication between units was unstable. At night, the jungle swallowed sounds, and even one's own footsteps seemed threatening. Many realized for the first time that the enemy could be just a few meters away, and at the same time, completely invisible. The first major clash was the battle at the Tenarú River. The Japanese command, underestimating the number and readiness of the Americans, launched an attack with forces that were not commensurate with the scale of the task. They acted according to their usual doctrine, a decisive night attack aimed at breaking through and demoralizing the enemy. But this time, something went wrong. The Americans already had machine guns, artillery, and a clear understanding that retreat would mean the loss of the airfield. When Japanese units emerged from the jungle and went on the attack, they came under devastating fire. The battle was short but fierce. For the U.S., this was the first sign that the Japanese could be stopped not only by numbers, but also by firepower and organization. However, this victory did not bring relief. On the contrary, it showed that the Japanese were ready to attack again and again. Night battles became routine. Every dark hour meant a possible attack. Soldiers slept fitfully, with their weapons in their hands. Exhaustion accumulated faster than ever before. The jungle began to affect the war no less than the enemy. Diseases mowed down people by the dozens. Malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections reduced the combat effectiveness of the units. Ammunition and food were spoiled by the climate. Even simple walking required effort. Guadalcanal was gradually turning into a war of survival. Japanese forces continued to bring in reinforcements, mostly at night, on fast ships. They were trying to gather enough men for a decisive strike on Henderson Field. Each such voyage meant that the battle for the island was just beginning. The Americans understood this, but could not completely stop the sea transfers. During this period, the war on Guadalcanal lost any resemblance to classic campaigns. There were no clear fronts, lines of advance, or quick results. There was only the perimeter, the jungle, and the constant expectation of attack. The soldiers began to change. They became quieter, more cautious, tougher. The night and the jungle became Japan's allies, but at the same time, they forced the Americans to learn faster than any training could. Guadalcanal was turning into a school of war, where mistakes cost lives. This stage of the campaign showed that the landing was only the beginning. The real battle for the island was still ahead, and it would be long, bloody, and exhausting for both sides. After the first clashes in the jungle, it became clear that the fate of Guadalcanal would not be decided on land alone. The island was a hub held together by two fragile pillars, the sea and the sky. Whoever controlled the approaches to it would determine who would have food, ammunition, reinforcements, and, ultimately, a chance to survive. That is why the struggle around Guadalcanal quickly turned into a series of fierce naval and air battles. The Japanese command understood perfectly well that if the Americans gained a foothold at the airfield, the island would be lost. That is why all efforts were directed toward destroying Henderson Field or isolating it. During the day, Japanese ships were vulnerable to American aircraft, so supplies began to be delivered at night. These fast destroyer runs became regular and deadly. The Americans called them a continuous stream of shadows that appeared out of the darkness and disappeared before dawn. The naval battles near Guadalcanal were chaotic and ruthless. They often took place at night, at short distances, without a clear understanding of the enemy's forces. Ships collided almost point blank. Artillery fired at random, and torpedoes flew into the darkness. The narrow straits around the island quickly turned into a graveyard of metal and men. Over time, this place acquired a gruesome name that reflected its essence. The American fleet, still recovering from the start of the war, paid a high price for each night. Mistakes, lack of experience, and poor coordination led to losses, but each battle was a lesson. Commanders learned to operate in the dark, use radar, and coordinate actions between ships. Guadalcanal became a tough school of naval warfare. During the day, the fighting moved to the air. Planes from Henderson Field took off with minimal fuel supplies, often under fire, but they were the island's only shield. These pilots, gathered from different units, operated at the limits of their capabilities. Their task was simple and deadly dangerous: to prevent Japanese ships from approaching during the day and destroying the airfield. Air battles over the island and the sea were constant. Japanese bombers tried to destroy the runways, while American fighters rose to meet them, often worn out and understaffed. Every day was a struggle for a few hours of control over the sky. If the airfield was operational, the island lived. If not, it was doomed. Supplies to American troops remained unstable. Ships could not always approach, and cargo was often lost or destroyed. Soldiers on the island suffered from a shortage of food, ammunition, and medicine. But they also knew that the Japanese had it even harder. Their night flights delivered people, but could not provide enough heavy weapons and supplies. The war was gradually becoming a war of attrition. It was during this period that it became clear that Guadalcanal was not a single battle, but dozens of interconnected battles. Defeat at sea could destroy success on land. The loss of the airfield could nullify any efforts by the fleet. Everything was held in a delicate balance that could be broken at any moment. By the end of this stage of the campaign, neither side had complete superiority. But Japan was gradually losing its ability to act flexibly. Every night flight was costly. Every ship destroyed was a heavy blow. The United States, on the contrary, although it lost a lot, was able to replace its losses and increase pressure. The battle for the sea and sky around Guadalcanal showed that this was no longer a war of quick conquests. It was a war where the winner would be the one who could hold out the longest, and it gradually became clear that the U.S. was beginning to tip the scales in its favor. By the fall of 1942, it became clear that Guadalcanal would not be decided by a quick strike from either side. The Japanese command gathered its forces for a large-scale attempt to break through the American perimeter around Henderson Field. This was to be the decisive moment. If the airfield fell, the island would be lost. For the United States, this prospect meant not just defeat, but the end of the first major offensive operation in the Pacific. Ground fighting became fiercer and more intense. Japanese units, brought in by night flights, began to prepare for a frontal assault. They acted with the same determination that had previously brought them success, but now the conditions were different. The Americans already had experience, fortified positions, and an understanding that every meter of land mattered. One of the most difficult moments of this stage was the fighting for the heights near the perimeter. In the darkness, Japanese units attacked wave after wave, trying to break through the defenses. Machine guns overheated, ammunition ran out, and men fought almost hand to hand. It was a war without maneuver, where survival depended on resilience and the ability to hold one's position even when it seemed that there was no strength left. The American defense held not because of numerical superiority, but because of coordination. Artillery worked at short ranges, infantry covered the flanks, and communications were maintained even under fire. The troops learned to fight as a single mechanism. It was a difficult school, but it produced results. For Japanese soldiers, these attacks were a test of their limits. They advanced through the jungle without sufficient artillery support, often hungry and exhausted. The plan called for a decisive breakthrough, but the reality was different. The American perimeter did not crumble, and each failed attack cost Japan hundreds of lives. The climactic battles of this period showed the difference in approaches to war. The Japanese doctrine relied on offensive spirit and willingness to sacrifice. The American doctrine relied on firepower, organization, and mutual support. At Guadalcanal, it became clear that in a protracted campaign, the second approach was beginning to prevail. After several weeks of fierce fighting, it became clear that the Japanese plan to break through had failed. Henderson Field remained in U.S. hands. The airfield continued to operate, which meant that the island continued to live. This fact was decisive for the further course of the campaign. The losses on both sides were heavy, but for Japan they were particularly painful. It was becoming increasingly difficult to recover such losses on a remote island. For the U.S., these battles confirmed that they were capable not only of advancing, but also of holding their ground under constant pressure. The jungles of Guadalcanal became a place where the war lost all its romance. There were no quick victories here, only gradual exhaustion. But it was in this exhaustion that the outcome began to emerge. Japan was losing momentum, while the United States was gaining confidence. This stage became a turning point in the land battle. Although the campaign was far from over, it became clear that Guadalcanal would not be easily returned to Japanese control. And that meant that the war in the Pacific was entering a new phase. After the climactic ground battles, Guadalcanal did not become quieter. It became slower. The war lost its sharp surges and entered a state of constant pressure, where the main enemies were not only bullets, but hunger, disease, and exhaustion. It was in this phase of the campaign that a turning point began to form, one that no longer depended on a single battle or a single decision. American troops held the perimeter, but the price was high. Malaria struck units faster than Japanese fire. Dysentery, fungal infections, and fevers took people out of action en masse. Many soldiers looked years older, even though only months had passed. Constant moisture corroded clothing and equipment, and sleep became a rare luxury. The Japanese situation was even worse. Transferring reinforcements by night flights could no longer meet the basic needs of the army. People arrived without sufficient food, ammunition, and medicine. The jungle did not provide what they had hoped for. Local resources were quickly exhausted. Hunger became a constant companion, breaking even the most disciplined units. The fighting continued, but it became shorter and less intense. These were skirmishes over patrols, trails, and nameless hills. Each side tried to conserve its strength, but at the same time not allow the enemy to recover. The war turned into a contest of endurance. For the U.S., supplies remained a key factor. They were irregular and dangerous, but they still existed. Each successful flight meant new ammunition, medicine, and sometimes hot food. For the Japanese, each lost ship meant not only defeat at sea, but also the doom of the people on the island. The psychological state of the troops was changing. The Americans, who had recently doubted the success of the operation, began to believe that they could hold out. Not to win quickly, but to endure. This was an important change. Japanese soldiers, on the contrary, increasingly realized that the island was becoming a trap. Retreat was almost impossible, and the prospects for a breakthrough were fading. The Japanese command was faced with a harsh reality. Each new attempt at an offensive was too costly, and the chances of success were dwindling. At the same time, leaving Guadalcanal meant admitting the first major defeat in the land campaign. This was politically and morally difficult to accept. Despite all the difficulties, the American command began to plan ahead. Guadalcanal gradually ceased to be a temporary staging ground and became the basis for further action. The airfield was operating more stably, the Air Force was acting more confidently, and the fleet was gaining experience. It was during this phase that it became clear that Japan was no longer dictating the pace. It was reacting, trying to hold on. But the initiative was slowly shifting to the United States. It was not a sharp break, but a creeping, almost imperceptible process that manifested itself every day, in the amount of ammunition, in the condition of the people, in the ability to think about tomorrow. Guadalcanal began to break not only Japanese plans, but also the very model of warfare on which Japan had built its successes. The war of attrition turned out to be the type of conflict in which the U.S. had the advantage. And although the campaign was far from over, it was here, amid disease and fatigue, that confidence was born. The first U.S. offensive operation would not fail. It would survive. And that meant that the war in the Pacific would never be the same again. By November 1942, it had become clear that the future of Guadalcanal depended not on a single assault or attack in the jungle, but on control of the sea. The sea was the artery through which life and death flowed to the island. And it was here that Japan made its last serious attempt to turn the tide in its favor. The Japanese command gathered its forces for a decisive strike. The plan was simple and desperate. Destroy Henderson Field with heavy artillery fire from the sea, deliver large reinforcements and heavy weapons, and then launch a decisive land offensive. It was a chance, perhaps the last one, to regain control of the island. The Americans knew something was brewing, but they didn't have the full picture. Intelligence was patchy, information was delayed, and decisions had to be made under conditions of uncertainty. However, one thing was clear. If the Japanese ships broke through and carried out their plan, it would be almost impossible to hold the island. The night battles that unfolded in November were among the fiercest of the entire Pacific War. The narrow straits around the island were once again filled with gunfire, explosions, and chaos. Ships converged at distances where decisions had to be made in seconds. Mistakes cost hundreds of lives. The American fleet acted with desperate determination. The commanders understood that retreat meant losing the island. Ships went into battle even when the odds were not in their favor. These were battles where tactics often gave way to courage and improvisation to planning. The losses were enormous on both sides. Ships sank, leaving behind only debris and fuel stains on the water. The sea around Guadalcanal once again confirmed its terrible reputation, but it gradually became clear that the Japanese fleet could no longer operate as freely as before. Every attempt to break through was too costly. The decisive factor was that the Japanese failed to destroy Henderson Field. The airfield continued to function, and during the day, American aviation regained control of the sea. Japanese transport ships became easy prey, and the delivery of heavy weapons was disrupted. After these battles, the Japanese command seriously considered abandoning Guadalcanal for the first time. This decision was not quick or easy. It meant acknowledging that the strategic initiative had been lost. But reality left no other choice. The troops on the island were exhausted, and there was almost no chance of changing the situation. For the United States, these naval battles marked a transition from defense to confidence. For the first time, the American fleet was not just holding back Japan, but breaking its plans. Guadalcanal ceased to be a vulnerable bridgehead and became a stronghold for further action. It was the sea that put an end to Japan's hopes for the island. From then on, the struggle was no longer for victory, but for how and when to retreat. The campaign was entering its final phase. After the November naval battles and the failure of plans to destroy Henderson Field, the Japanese command was faced with a reality that could no longer be ignored. Guadalcanal was no longer a point of attack. It had become a trap. The island, which was supposed to ensure Japan's further advance southward, was now sucking up resources, manpower, and time without any prospect of success. On the island, Japanese troops were in a state close to disaster. Hunger became a daily occurrence. Soldiers ate minimal rations or whatever they could find in the jungle. Disease mowed down people as mercilessly as American fire. Ammunition was running low. Heavy weapons had almost disappeared, and the possibility of receiving reinforcements was becoming increasingly illusory. The Americans sensed this change. Japanese attacks lost their mass and coordination. Instead of decisive assaults, there were minor skirmishes, reconnaissance in force, and attempts to buy time. It was not an offensive, but a delaying of the inevitable. The war on the island was slowly dying out, although it remained dangerous. Complex discussions continued in Japanese headquarters. Withdrawal from Guadalcanal meant the empire's first major land defeat. This undermined the myth of the inevitability of Japanese victories and had serious consequences for the morale of the army and navy. But the alternative, the complete destruction of the garrison, was even worse. In the end, a decision was made that had previously been considered unacceptable: evacuation. This plan required extreme caution. The evacuation had to be carried out in such a way that the Americans did not realize what was happening and did not turn the retreat into a massacre. As with previous supplies, it had to be carried out at night, with fast ships, under the cover of darkness. It was not an operation for victory, but to save what could still be saved. On the island itself, Japanese soldiers were not told all the details. Many continued to hold their positions, unaware that their army was preparing to leave. Others guessed, but had neither the strength to resist nor the emotion to care. Guadalcanal had taken almost everything from them: their health, their hope, their sense of the future. American patrols gradually advanced, encountering less and less resistance. The jungle that had previously hidden the enemy now often revealed abandoned positions, destroyed shelters, and traces of a hasty retreat. It did not look like a triumphant offensive. It looked like the weary end of a long struggle. The last battles were short and localized. Japanese units covered their retreat, delaying the Americans where they could, but avoiding large-scale clashes. Their task was no longer to win, but simply to give the ships time to approach and pick up their men. For the U.S., this period was one of caution. The command was in no hurry to declare victory. They remembered all too well how the enemy had disappeared before, only to strike again. Only gradually did it become clear that the Japanese were indeed leaving the island. Guadalcanal was entering its final phase. The campaign, which had begun as a risky experiment, was now slowly coming to an end, but its true significance was yet to be revealed. At the beginning of 1943, Guadalcanal changed. What had been a continuous battlefield just a few months earlier gradually became quieter. The jungle, accustomed to explosions and gunfire, was once again filled with the sounds of nature. But this silence was deceptive. It carried traces of exhaustion, loss, and a long struggle that ended without a grand finale. American units advanced cautiously. Experience had taught them not to trust the silence. Every abandoned position was checked. Every hill was cleared. However, more and more often they found only traces of retreat, abandoned equipment, empty shelters, weapons that no one could hold anymore. Japanese resistance disappeared not because of defeat in a single battle, but because of complete exhaustion of resources. The evacuation of Japanese troops went almost unnoticed. Night flights took away those who could still be saved. For many, it was a miracle to leave the island that had become a symbol of suffering. But for even more soldiers, Guadalcanal remained the site of their last battle. The campaign took away not only people from Japan, but also its belief in the infallibility of its own strategy. When it became clear that there was no longer any organized resistance, the American command officially declared the campaign over. This was not accompanied by celebrations. The victory was difficult and exhausting. The soldiers looked at the island they had held at the cost of disease, hunger, and constant fear, and felt no triumph. They felt relief. Guadalcanal looked devastated after the fighting. The airfield was operational, but around it lay destroyed positions, wrecked aircraft, and traces of artillery strikes. The jungle still hid many bodies that were never found. The island became a silent witness to what war can be like when pushed to the limits of human endurance. For the United States, the end of the campaign meant more than just the capture of the island. It was the first major offensive victory in the war against Japan. It was not lightning fast or spectacular, but it showed that the Japanese army could not only be stopped, but also forced to retreat. This had enormous psychological significance for the troops and for the country as a whole. American soldiers who had been through Guadalcanal were no longer rookies. They had become veterans of a new type of war, a war of jungles, night battles, and exhaustion. This experience would later become the foundation for subsequent operations in the Pacific. What had been learned here would no longer have to be paid for at the same price in the future. For Japan, the consequences were deeper than they seemed at first glance. The loss of Guadalcanal meant the loss of strategic initiative. From now on, Japan was forced to react, defend itself, and patch up the gaps. The war it had planned to wage offensively began to slowly turn against it. The campaign was over, but its impact was just beginning to be felt. Guadalcanal was no longer just a point on the map. It became a symbol of a turning point, a place where the war in the Pacific changed direction. The island fell silent, but that silence spoke louder than any guns. When the campaign on Guadalcanal ended, its true significance was not yet fully understood. It was not a victory that immediately changed borders or ended the war, but it is often such victories that prove decisive. Guadalcanal became the turning point after which the war in the Pacific took a different course. Slow, difficult, but irreversible for Japan. For the United States, this campaign was a turning point in the deepest sense. For the first time, America conducted a large-scale offensive operation against Japan and not only survived, but also won. It was not a technical or numerical victory, but a systemic one. It proved that the U.S. was capable of fighting far from home, in a hostile environment, against an enemy with experience, motivation, and strict discipline. Guadalcanal became a school of war. It was here that the principles were born that would later define the entire American offensive in the Pacific. The interaction of the Navy, Air Force, and ground forces, control of the air as the key to success, and war of attrition as a strategy against Japan. The mistakes made here were never repeated on such a scale. For American soldiers and Marines, Guadalcanal became the line between before and after. Those who had been through this island no longer had any illusions about war. They knew that victory did not come quickly and did not look heroic. It came through dirt, disease, fear, and fatigue. It was these people who would later lead the United States through Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. For Japan, the consequences were even more profound. Guadalcanal was the empire's first major land defeat that could not be hidden or explained away as an accident. The loss of the island meant the loss of strategic initiative. From then on, Japan no longer determined where and when the offensive would take place. It began to defend itself. This campaign also exposed the weaknesses of the Japanese military system: limited resources, dependence on sea supply routes, and the inability to quickly recover losses. All of this became apparent on Guadalcanal. The war that Japan had hoped to win with quick strikes and moral pressure turned into a war where its advantages were melting away every day. In a global context, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat. It paved the way for the island-by-island strategy that would eventually lead the United States to the shores of the Japanese islands. Each subsequent operation would be difficult, but none would be as uncertain as the first. Guadalcanal also changed the psychology of the war. The myth of Japan's invincibility was shattered. The Allies saw that the empire could be stopped and made to pay a price for every meter. For American society, this was the first real proof that the war in the Pacific could be won. The island itself remained a silent witness to these changes. The jungle reclaimed the trenches, and the ruined positions gradually disappeared under the vegetation. But the memory of Guadalcanal remained, as the place where the war ceased to be defensive and became offensive. The years 1942 to 1943 on Guadalcanal did not end the war, but they determined who would ultimately reach its conclusion from a position of strength. The first major U.S. offensive operation was bloody, chaotic, and far from perfect, but it fulfilled its main role. It changed the course of the war.